Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I'm going to answer a question I received from a subscriber about the PhD in counseling or counseling education supervision as compared to the master's degree. And I've actually had a few questions on this topic. The specific question is really asking, is it worth it when you have a master's degree to move on to a PhD? Now again, this is specific to counseling, but I think at some level it's also applicable to related fields like marriage and family therapy, social work. Psychology is a little different because only in a few places can somebody with a master's degree in psychology be licensed as a psychologist. Most of the time you'd have to have a Ph.D. or a Ph.D. So that's kind of a separate thing. But in terms of counseling, social work, marriage and family therapy, all these professions can be licensed with a master's degree, and the PhD doesn't add any licensure value. So that's really the question here is it worth it to get the PhD? Should I go from the master's to the PhD? So I think this is an interesting question, but I think that you have to consider the questions around this area in a particular order. And maybe the first question would be, what do I want to do? So PhD isn't really so much an identity as a level of education. I know that all levels of education are to some extent both. But if you think of it in terms of what do I want to do, what type of work do I want to do, and what can I already do with a master's degree? So as far as doing it strictly for an identity, like just to be able to call yourself a doctor or a PhD, I don't think this really makes a lot of sense. The PhD is very difficult to get, it's very expensive, and to do that just to be able to call yourself a doctor seems like a real waste of resources all the way around. And if you really did want that, there are doctoral level degrees that are much easier to get than a PhD in counselor education supervision. So I'm really not a big fan of the idea of getting a doctorate just to call yourself a doctor. The privilege, I suppose, it would be considered of calling yourself a doctor is really a small part of the reason somebody would go on to a PhD. Maybe for some people it's part of the equation, and I get that, but it's about what you can do. It's about what type of opportunities are opened up with that degree that I think really make the degree more valuable. Other questions you may want to ask first would be, am I good at math? I think this is a question that a lot of doctoral students or people consider applying to doctoral programs don't really consider very well. But statistics is a huge part of a PhD, and I don't know how people can really go into it without being somewhat good at math unless they really want to set themselves up for a tremendous amount of work. It's already a lot of work to start with, but if you don't have a basic understanding of statistics and mathematics in general, it can really be challenging. Another related question would be, do you like to write? Because writing is a huge part of getting that PhD. There's a lot of writing and a lot of statistics. So those would be the first three questions. What do I want to do? Am I good at math? Do I like to write? Now, then we have to look at really the cost benefit, right? So is getting a PhD worth it? Well, let's take a look at financially. If you could go to a school where they're going to pretty much give you the PhD in terms of financial component, you still have to work for it in terms of the academics, of course, but if they're going to give it to you from a financial perspective with grants, scholarships, whatever, well, that really changes the cost-benefit analysis a lot. But that's not something that's fairly common. I would say for a lot of PhD programs, you're going to spend somewhere between $50,000 and $150,000 over the whole course of the PhD. That's just in tuition, not necessarily considering other costs that could be associated with that. Now, that is again spread over usually several years, anywhere from 3 to 5 years, but still that's a lot of money, and you could do a lot of other things with that much money. So there's a real opportunity cost, not just do you have that much money or can you take out loans, but also what could you do with that money otherwise. So if you just happen to have $100,000 laying around and didn't want to spend it on a PhD, you could start a private practice, you could launch a consulting business. With a master's degree, that's still possible. We usually think of consulting as more of a doctoral level, but it can certainly be done with a master's. there are a lot of different possibilities. You could pay off your home early, pay off motor vehicles early, whatever. There's just a lot of advantages to using that money in some other way. So that opportunity cost has to be kept in mind too. Now, if you're borrowing money, you have to also keep in mind what can you make with a PhD in counseling as opposed to a master's degree. If it's not a large difference in income, you're going to have potentially a really long time to pay off that loan, depending on what other sources of income you have. So the next cost benefit would be time. And again, there's an opportunity cost here, but it's a lot of time, 3 to 5 years. And it's not just the number of years, really. I mean, that certainly has an effect on people. It's the number of hours per week. It's just such a tremendous commitment. And really, in a sense, it hijacks your life for that entire time. And I don't mean that necessarily as a negative thing, but it does. It just takes over your life for that entire period of time. And it takes literally years after getting the PhD to fully get your life back, to recover from that incredible amount of effort for that much time. So there's a real commitment in terms of the time to get the PhD, and then you have to build in a recovery period as well. I don't think it's really completely rational to view the PhD as something that you earn and then it's over and you're kind of free of the consequences of that much work. Also, in terms of time, we could factor in like family life, time with friends, time engaging in other activities. All that's gone when you're studying to get a PhD. You really just have to, at some level, you just have to say, I'm putting that all aside, which seems quite irresponsible in one way, but I don't know how else to do it. I don't know how else to work to pay the bills and then to also study enough to get the PhD. If you didn't have to work during the time when you're getting a PhD, that would certainly be convenient. But then again, if you look at a lot of the work necessary to get the PhD, like different components of the internship and some of the classes, they involve field experience. So it's really not pragmatic to take off work during that period of time. You really have to be working in the field when you're working toward a PhD. The next area is effort, which in a way is similar to time. It takes a tremendous amount of effort to get a PhD. I mentioned that, and you could use that effort for something else. So you could use your money, your time, and your effort for something else. There's a massive opportunity cost there that you have to factor in. Another thing I'd like to touch on here is, and I kind of talked about this a little bit, when you earn a PhD, when you finally get the PhD and you're technically a doctor, that's really the beginning of the work and not the end. So you've worked hard for 3 to 5 years, harder than you've ever worked in your life, and now the work really starts. So it's not something you really achieve in the sense of, I can get there and put it behind me and now things are going to be easy. Look at just some of the aspects of what it takes to maintain an expert level of knowledge in a certain field, whether it's counseling or anything else. For example, my reading for a particular week is anywhere from about 15 articles to around 30 articles. That's just my reading. That's not any of the other work. And that's the reading I would do whether or not I made YouTube videos. I did that much reading before I got involved with YouTube. So that's just to maintain a good understanding of the field and keep up with everything and keep adding knowledge. That doesn't include time teaching, consulting, supervising, conducting research, all those other things. So this really brings me to an important point about the master's degree in counseling compared to the PhD. You can do a lot with a master's degree in counseling. You can treat clients, you can have a private practice, you can supervise, consult, and conduct research. What advantages are you really going to get from moving up to the PhD? Are they really going to be massive enough of an advantage compared to the master's degree? Again, the master's degree is a highly flexible degree. It's actually a really good degree. It's a good value. Because you can get licensed with it and the other things I mentioned, it just makes that degree so valuable, and that makes so much sense. The PhD, you really have to think through, again, what am I going to do? So if you're looking to do something that you absolutely can't do with a master's degree, and one example could be teaching full-time at a university. That can sometimes be a struggle with a master's degree. Some of the higher level consulting work is much easier to get with a PhD, especially if it involves statistics. And even something like supervising. You can definitely supervise with a master's degree in most areas. But with the PhD, it's just easier to get that kind of work because people naturally think doctor when they think supervisor. So if you look at those potential advantages of a PhD and you don't really see something there that you need, I would say generally a PhD in counseling, and of course by that I mean counselor education supervision, I don't really think it's worth it for most people who have a master's degree in counseling. I don't think it's something that's going to pay off in the long run when you look at the money and the time and the effort and all that opportunity cost. Again, the master's degree is such a flexible degree and you can do so much with it. I really don't see an edge there. Now, if you're looking at other related professions, again, I think it's mostly similar, like social work and marriage and family therapy. I think a lot of the same constructs I mentioned here would apply. Certainly not all, but I think many would. And psychology, again, as I talked about that earlier, that's a lot different. I mean, you have the master's level psychologists that can be licensed in some areas, or they can get licensed as some other type of clinician. But usually it takes a Ph.D., which is a doctorate that focuses on the clinical aspects, or a Ph.D., which of course is very similar to other Ph.D.s in the different mental health treatment professional fields. So psychology might be a little different. You really have to consider a lot more up front. You can't really get a master's degree and then be a practitioner and then build on that like you can with counseling. You really have to look at that PhD and kind of decide to go for it or not. Counseling is a little more flexible, mostly in the sense that we can get a master's degree first, and then we can think about, do we want to go ahead for that PhD? And if we decide we don't want to go ahead, we have a degree that's quite usable in almost every jurisdiction. So that's the real distinction I see between counseling and psychology as far as the PhD. So it may seem a little unusual for me to say in most cases a PhD is not a good idea when I have a PhD in counselor education supervision, but I think that's just the reality of it. I don't think it's a matter of we should always promote the degree we have. It doesn't make sense for everybody. And I think in this case it doesn't make sense for most people, even those who would typically be highly interested, like people who have master's degrees in counseling. But to be sure, it does have many advantages, and for some people it's absolutely the right choice. And I would say, rather than just make the decision based on something that I'm saying, really explore the different doctoral programs out there. If you're interested, talk to doctoral students and recent graduates. I would say talk to at least 5 or 6 people in each of those categories if you can. It's really hard to get too much information in that respect. And if it's something you want to do, and again, you're fairly good at math and you like to write, and it lines up with your goals, then I would say go for it. Apply to PhD programs, see what happens. Of course, the programs are extremely competitive, so for many people I would say you should plan on applying to quite a few, and there will be a lot of rejection there. That's one of the things you have to get kind of comfortable with when applying to doctoral programs. But if you get in and you go through the 3 to 5 years and you get that PhD, yes, of course that can be very rewarding, and you can do a lot of different types of work with it. I'm certainly not saying the PhD is a bad degree or anything like that. I just think when you compare it to the master's degree, I see that degree as just such a great degree all around, just a flexible degree that leads to licensure, and it's hard to see how the PhD offers that type of kind of amazing value like we see with the master's degree. So, not that this question was asked, but obviously I'm a big fan of the master's degree in counseling. I think that makes sense for a lot more people than does the PhD in counseling. But again, you really have to look at the situation and ask a lot of people. It's certainly worth exploring if you have an interest in it. So I hope you found this discussion of the pros and cons of getting a PhD to be interesting. Thanks for watching.